Okay, so welcome everyone. I know there'll be a few folks still joining as we go ahead and get started. So my name's Kathleen. I'll be your online facilitator today, and I'm with the Forest Business Alliance team. So welcome. And we want to go ahead and just get a sense of who's in the room. So while we're getting situated and settled and admitting the final few folks that are registered, if you could go ahead and put in the chat where you're calling in from and what affiliation you have, what organization or business you're with. And please put that in the chat so we can get a sense of who's here, and everybody can also see who's in the room together. So when you have a moment, just go ahead and put that in the chat. The overview of the day is we're going to have a few minutes of an overview, a little bit about the Forest Business Alliance, and then we will have two folks speaking to specific topics with several slides and information about specific grant proposal coming up for CAL FIRE, as well as other questions. And then we have at least half the time for questions and answers that you all might have, specific questions on the process and the proposals. So that's how it's gonna run. We will allow time and space if there's questions about specific slides or specific topics. We'll also have space and time for that as well. So thank you for popping in that information in the chat, and then everyone can kind of see who's here. If you're just joining, just please put in your name and your affiliation, who you're with and where you're calling in from. And then we'd like to get a sense too. Well, let me go ahead in just a moment. I'm going to start the slide, but we'd like to get a sense here of who was on the CAL FIRE call webinar yesterday. So since the majority of people are off camera, it might just be easier to put this in the chat. If you were, and actually, why don't we do this? If you were, go ahead and raise your hand in the Zoom. That'll be easiest. So under reactions, if you click on the little up arrow next to reactions, you can just say raise your hand. And that way we'll just get a sense of who, if you were on the call yesterday, please raise your hand. We just want to get a sense of how to structure today's call and information so it's most effective for you all, and that will be helpful information to have it, and just leave it up until we get a sense of who has responded, and then you can take it down afterward. Okay, so far it looks about like half of the people were on the call yesterday. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. That's helpful information for our presenters. You can go ahead and lower your hands if you've raised them. Thank you for that. Okay. And if you have just joined us, then you'll notice in the chat, people are introducing themselves. Please share where you're calling from and who you are associated with or affiliated with business-wise, organization-wise. And then we have a sense of who's in the room and how we might be most helpful for all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Our presenters today, where I see, okay, there they are, Carrie Ryan and Chris Sacco. And so we will start. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with their presentation, which suddenly I can't find. Please. Well, it was just here a second ago. Thanks for your patience, everyone. There we go. Okay, you see that okay, Carrie? I can't see it. Okay. So this is just to make sure you're in the right place. Insights for CAL FIRE Business and Workforce Development Grant Applications. And if you are viewing this You can always move your screen over depending on how much. There's a little gray bar between where it shows the participants in the room and what's being displayed on the screen. And you can move your mouse over that and click and move it so you can see more of what the screen is or more of the people. So let's go ahead and okay, oops. So Carrie, do you want to go ahead and give a little overview of?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks so much, Kathleen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's really exciting to see so many people and also to see where you're all from. It's really amazing to see the the breadth of locations across the state where you're all located. So thank you for sharing that. I'm Carrie Rennie, and I'm part of the Forest Business Alliance team. We are a group of folks who are funded by CAL FIRE and also by Yuba Water Agency to provide technical assistance, workshops, and peer learning networks. And all of these are focused on building capacity for forest sector businesses and organizations. And I'll go over in detail at the very end of this webinar what kind of technical assistance we provide. It is largely focused on CAL FIRE's Business and Workforce Development Program. However, we do provide technical assistance to other grant programs as well. And our peer learning network is pretty active and continuing. So there are lots of ways to learn from each other and share information. And Kathleen, if you want to pop the Forest Business Alliance website into the chat, you can go to the website to find out more information or to find our contact information.
Yeah, I will do that shortly. Thank you, Carrie. Okay, I'm going to stop share for just a moment so I can also bring up the other document. So we'd also like to get a show of hands. And again, you can raise your hand in the Zoom room for this. Who has actually started your grant application for CAL FIRE if you're planning to attend or planning to apply? So again, if you have started already, and you can go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom. It's just to get a sense of where folks are at, and then again, how to structure the information today. So no shame if you haven't. We just want to get a sense who has. So just raising the hand in Zoom. So it looks like about five or six folks so far have. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So you can go ahead and lower that then. And then we're going to provide an opportunity to, again, for you to ask lots of questions throughout this. If you have specific questions, either after yesterday's call about the questions that brought up or questions that you already have, I'll invite you to put those in the chat. And as Carrie is giving a presentation, I will check in with those. Specifically, if there's questions about co-benefits or greenhouse gas emissions questions or anything else that came up in that presentation, if there's a succinct question you want to put in the chat, we'll make sure that the presenters get to that. And you might also think about what are some of the biggest pinch points or stuck places that you have in your grant application, and make sure that we can address those as you're applying. And if you're not sure yet, that's fine. But if you have something that you know you'd like to get some attention to, please go ahead and put that into the chat, and then we can make sure that we attend to those. And Carrie, as I'm sharing screen, if I am looking at the chat, are you seeing that too, or does that interfere with the presentation?
I don't believe that I can see the chat, but I can click in and out. So I think that's just fine while you're sharing screen. I'll try and keep track of that.
Okay. And well, I just wanted to see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start then again. So here we go. So, okay. Can you see that okay? Okay, so this will be part of what we're speaking to today. Grant types and eligible activities, proposal components, new requirement, common budget concerns, environmental permitting, grant and project readiness, and then an overview of the Forest Business Line technical assistance that we can provide. And we've really provided there's a lot of opportunity to get support from the Forest Business Alliance. So I just want to start with that. So Chris, are you ready to unmute and go ahead and start?
I am. Thanks, Kathleen. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Some of what I'm about to say, these next few slides may be repetitive for the folks who were on the CAL FIRE call yesterday, but for the people, maybe a good reinforcement of what you heard, and for the people who weren't there, that might be useful. You might be hearing it for the first time. So the CAL FIRE Business and Workforce Development Grant Program, the purpose of it is to maintain and enhance the forest sector workforce and businesses of California to promote healthy and resilient forests throughout the state. The program achieves this by supporting business development and workforce development projects through grants. Those are the two project types for this round of funding that are eligible. It's also worth noting that some research proposals that have the potential to have an immediate impact and to facilitate forest sector businesses and workforce might also be considered, although those are not necessarily given the highest priority. So if any research program that you might propose has to be directly related to business and workforce development, and again, it may not be the highest priority, so just keep that in mind. In terms of eligible projects, if you look at the solicitation materials that CAL FIRE put out for this round, you'll find those on pages 2 and 3. They give a number of examples of eligible projects. And there's also on those, on page 3 of the solicitation, you'll find a list of preferred projects. Those are the Wood Products team has identified those as being currently strategic in advancing the forest sector. Proposals that incorporate those preferred projects may receive additional consideration, so it's something to keep in mind. You can go on to the next slide if you would. The proposal component. So I've divided this into 2 slides. The first bit is on the eCivis application. As you read through the guidelines, you'll see that eCivis is mentioned a number of times. You must complete and submit all your application materials, including uploading required documentation using that portal. So CAL FIRE will not accept any hard copies or emailed copies. So if it's not submitted through eCivis, it won't count towards your submission. The first 5 things on this slide, the applicant profile, general project information, applicant information, detailed budget, and detailed goals, those are going to be essentially the same fields for all applicants, whether they're business or workforce development. The 6th item on there it will differ slightly, and you can see there's 2 columns there. They're similar, but they'll be a little bit different in eCivis when you're working through that application, depending on which type of grant you're applying for. Go on to the next slide. Yeah, up, one more up. There you go. So in addition, again, everything goes through eCivis, the platform. There's a number of attachments that you're going to have to submit through eCivis that you'll have to fill those out and then attach them to the document or to the there'll be little boxes in the eCivis platform where you'll upload those and attach them to your application. So there's a list on here. I won't go through all these in detail. They're all listed out in the solicitation materials as well. But the budget and goal forms, which it's worth noting on those that we've developed a number of templates that will help you fill those out. We will talk about that a little more towards the end of the presentation, but those 2 forms will need to be filled out and submitted. You also have to submit a CV or resume of the primary contact person and any of your partners who you're going to be working with, the scope of work document, which is limited to 5 pages, a statement of qualifications, a work plan, environmental compliance worksheets, signed letters of participation, letters of support, and then for business development applicants only, a business plan. And then for everyone, for both types of grants, you'll have to submit some environmental documents. Most of these documents can be submitted in using PDF or Word. There's, in the case of the environmental documents, depending on you can also upload a zip folder. Again, these templates are all available in the grantee resources section of the FBA website. So I really encourage people to look at those because we've spent quite a lot of time developing templates to help you with different pieces of the application. Again, we'll talk about those a little more towards the end. Go ahead to the next one. So revised CAL FIRE application scoring. There we go. Things have changed. Anyone who submitted during the last round, you may have noticed this, but the scoring has changed. You'll find it on pages 8 through 14 of the current solicitation, the current scoring. But things that have changed since last time. For the business development applications, the business plan and budget criteria have both been reduced by 5 points. Their value has been reduced by 5 points. The project impact has been reduced by 10 points. And then those points were moved over or added to project readiness, which is increased by 10 points. And then there's a new required section about priority populations, which has been added, and that is worth 10 points for business development applications. For workforce development applications, the project background criteria has been reduced. That scoring criterion has been reduced by 10 points. Project readiness has picked up 5 of those points. That's increased by 5 points. And then the priority population has been added with a maximum score of 10 points as well. So that's also new to the workforce development applications. This is going to be, again, when we talk about priority population, it's going to be, you're going to see, we'll talk more about that later in the presentation, but that's an important new addition. Funding limits and revised match requirements. There's also been some changes to these two things, the funding limits and match requirements. The big changes are the maximum award for business development grants is now increased to 3 million. And there is now a 2-to-1 match is required for grants over 1 million for business development. Prior to that, it was 2 million before, and it was 500,000. It required 2-to-1 match over 500,000, but currently you can ask for up to 3 million, and you're going to be asked for a 2-to-1 match over 1 million. Also, notably, the transportation subsidy grant type is no longer available for this round. That's an important update as well. There's quite a few other changes in the guidelines, but we'll talk about many of those. But I encourage everyone to read the guidelines, especially if you need to read them. But if you read them last time, if you applied to a previous round, just know that there's quite a few changes this time around. We talk about some of them, but not all during this presentation. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, these are some of the big new additions. For this round of funding, the grant money is coming for the California Air Resources Board, CARB. And so they're asking that your application, it needs to really clearly articulate how your project will contribute to greenhouse gas emission reductions. That being said, you don't need to calculate GHG benefits in your application. You just need to provide a qualitative description in your application. And then if you're successful, CAL FIRE will help, actually CAL FIRE staff will run through the calculation for the successful applicants. So you don't need to worry about doing it yourself. It can be quite complicated. If your project is facilitating some kind of either wood biomass utilization, biomass for being removed from forests and used for energy generation or development of durable wood products. You might want to make you might want to take a look at the way CAL FIRE is calculating the GHG, or will be calculating the GHG reduction. And there's a few documents that we can provide links to later. They're quite lengthy, but it could be helpful for certain applicants, especially ones I just mentioned, to have a sense of how CAL FIRE will calculate those reductions for successful applicants. And again, we don't have time today to go over that, but there's a CARB qualification methodologies and calculator tool that, again, I think it's worth looking at if you have the time, inclination. And then there's also some important documents that CARB's put together about the co-benefits. So applicants for both types, this second and third bullet point I've got up there, applicants for both types of grants need to address co-benefits and benefits to disadvantaged or low-income communities in their scopes of works documents. And you'll be expected to report on those as well. Solicitation guidelines only call out the co-benefits under the business development requirement in the scope of work narrative, because CAL FIRE is anticipating that workforce development projects through job creation, training, et cetera, will by their nature generate co-benefits. But you still need to, even workforce development folks, even though it's kind of understood that you're going to be generating them, you really need to, wherever possible, emphasize that you're creating those in your application. And we can, again, I assume there's going to be questions about this, and we'll have time later to go over specifics. Let's see. We will be organizing a specific workshop about co-benefits. We're hoping to have that scheduled in the next couple of weeks. And you can also, again, reach out to FBA if you have any questions or need further support on co-benefits, GHG, or how you can make sure your application is responding to the disadvantaged population requirement. Can you go on to the next one? Yeah, so this is, again, there's a QR code in this slide that you can scan right now, actually, with your device, and it'll pull up this CARB funding guidelines table. But these are examples of common needs for priority populations that, again, will be a helpful document when you're trying to develop that piece of your narrative in the scope of work. So this will take you right to that table 5. But again, it's a new requirement, and we're anticipating folks are going to need some extra support with this. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out. Go to the next one. Okay, common budget concerns. Okay, so we've been through a few rounds of funding now, and these are some of the common budget concerns that people are raising when they're working on their applications. And first one is indirect costs. So it's important that workforce development projects managed by nonprofit grantees are the only project types that are eligible for indirect costs. So indirect charge, if you're a business development applicant, unfortunately, you can't apply for indirect costs. Also, for workforce development projects managed by nonprofits, even though you can charge them, just be aware that indirect charges cannot be applied to equipment purchases. So if you have any equipment, you need to exclude that from your budget, from your indirect calculation. And then the maximum allowable, generally speaking, the maximum allowable indirect rate is 12% for the eligible projects. So you can't charge more than that unless you get a specific exemption from CAL FIRE. And then even if you do get an exemption, just be aware that that exemption, you might get more than 12%, but you can't get more than 20%. That's the absolute limit that CAL FIRE would approve. If you, yeah, and even if you may apply for an exemption, but you may not get it. So just know if you're a nonprofit, workforce development, you can definitely apply the 12%. You might be able to get more, but it's not a guarantee. Another common concern is this in-kind contributions or the match. So how do we meet the match, right? People are always concerned about that. There's a pretty hefty match amount for many of the grants. Especially, so you see the CAL FIRE match for business development and workforce grants over 500,000, you know, it's even heftier, right? You get up in the neighborhood, I think it's 9 to 1 for over $1 million. So one way you can meet that requirement is to include grants from other state or federal programs that are contributing to the goals of the project you're submitting to CAL FIRE. Your match can include in-kind, non-cash contributions of valuable services, goods, or personnel contributions. In-kind contributions can include non-financial contributions to the project, like volunteer time. Just keep in mind that anything you count towards as in-kind or match has to happen during the grant period. So if you have a grant that is contributed to your project, but it ended before the CAL FIRE project starts, it's not eligible. Or if you have, whatever else you want to put towards your match, it has to happen during the grant period itself. It can't be before or after. That's an important thing to understand. And this is another one we've been talking about doing a separate session on some of these common budget issues. So if we don't cover it all here, we'll probably have a separate workshop, or at least maybe a working session with folks to help you work through some of these things. Prevailing wage requirement is another one that people are having concerned with. Just note that applicants are responsible for budgeting the prevailing wage when it's applicable. CAL FIRE doesn't have an opinion about it, so they're not checking that necessarily, but you're responsible for doing it. So according to the state of California's Department of Industrial Relations, all workers employed on public projects must be paid the prevailing wage determined by the director of the Department of Industrial Relations, according to the type of work and the location of the project. We can provide a link to that website, the Department of Industrial Relations, so you can check to see if your project is subject to this prevailing wage requirement. Generally, prevailing wages are specified in collective bargaining agreements. So if you don't have union employees on the project, you may not be subject to that requirement, but it's worth checking with the Department of Industrial Relations to be sure. And last but not least, inflation and wage increases. So projects can technically have a duration of up to 4 years. For this one, though, we should note that all these projects for this round must end prior to March 31st, 2026. And so, they won't be 4 years for this round, but in previous rounds, they could have lasted for up to 4 years technically. That being said, the budget form on the eCivis portal does not allow for annual cost increases. So whatever your charge on there, it's consistent across all years of the project. When there's high inflation rates, or you have, as we've seen in recent years, 5 or 6 or 7% inflation, if you don't account for that by year 3 or 4, it could be a big difference, right, in your budget. So overcoming this, you need to think really carefully about your unit cost and how you calculate those. In one of the templates that we provide, there is a inflation calculator that may be useful to people to help you in determining a unit cost that will be sure you cover your true cost for the duration of the project. And so Again, you can find that on the FBA website in the resources section. That is it on the up to there. So Carrie, I'll turn it over to you to continue on.
Kathleen, actually, before you move on,
Yep.
Chris and Kathleen, there were a couple of budget questions that came up in the chat, but I think it would be helpful to just
Okay.
pause and touch on those right now.
Yep.
And so Joel had asked, what's the best way to account for internal project management hours within the project? And Regine, thanks so much for jumping in there too. Regine Miller is part of our Forest Business Alliance team. And she highlighted that internal project management hours and costs for a business applicant can be counted as a matching contribution. And Joel, or maybe it was James, followed up with, do those hours need to be as a volunteer? And I just wanted to make sure that everyone saw that and notes it. So the hours for matching don't necessarily need to be volunteer hours or paid. So either way, the hours and expenses can be counted as match. They must directly go to the project activities that you're proposing within the time frame of the project that is funded by CAL FIRE. So you can count different parts of the project costs as match, as long as they're just directly applicable and happening for that specific project within the time frame of the project performance period. Joel and James or Regine or Chris, do any of you have follow-up questions to that or anything to add?
I don't have anything follow up, but I'd be happy if folks have, as you develop your budgets, if you have related questions, happy to help field those.
Great, thanks, Regine.
Thank you.
Same, yeah,
Carrie,
in kind. Is it match and in kind is a common question. So I think, yeah, we may indeed have another session on that, but
Yeah.
you can reach out one-to-one too, in the meantime.
And speaking of match, Eric had asked for the 1-to-9 match ratio for workforce development above 500,000. What can that look like? And just to reiterate something that CAL FIRE said yesterday and that Chris went over a little bit, the match doesn't necessarily need to be cash. It can be in kind, which means that it can be time that your staff is spending, that you're accounting for and putting toward the project activities. It can look like volunteer hours. Someone had asked a question yesterday about whether donating products that were a result of the project could be counted as match, and there were some back and forth about that. So if you have questions about just how flexible match can be, CAL FIRE is also really good. CAL FIRE staff can really speak directly to this. But if you want to just brainstorm some ideas about match, we're definitely here to help do that. But are there any other questions right now that we could cover about match? Or Eric, do you want to talk any more about what your question had to do with?
Yeah, and folks are welcome to come off mute to ask questions as well for this phase if you'd like to ask a specific question.
Thank you, Regine. Regine's also reminding us that match can include equipment or supplies. So if you are purchasing equipment with your own funds and using that equipment for the workforce development or training, then you can also include that. Or for example, if you're doing business development and you are purchasing a piece of equipment that will be used on a project site that is part of your project, but you're paying for half of that equipment and asking CAL FIRE to pay for the rest, that's an example of match.
And the other thing, go ahead, sorry.
All right, this is Melissa from Mighty Summit. I had a question that, what about trees? So the value of the trees, if we're working on a project where we're going to be using big cedar trees, and partnering with like the Forest Service, the value of those, because of the immense of the trees that we're using for the biomass, would that be considered something in kind as well? Because they're basically giving us those trees.
What's the final destination of the trees?
So the trees are going to be refurbished into a wood product that will be like split row fencing. So it's part of the project, but it's, you know, over 400 trees of cedar. And to go to a mill, it's over, you know, $500,000 to get them. But the Forest Service is saying in kind, is how they put it, that we could go out and get those trees.
Yeah, I think I'll give you my best guess, and then it'd be good if any other FBA folks have comments. And Jason, but if you're still on the line, it looks like Jason's still on. In the past, on some projects that I've been part of, CAL FIRE has allowed some in-kind match to count for contributions, basically the value of trees as an in-kind contribution towards, say, for instance, a sawmill. It's not as preferred as, for instance, cash match or a more direct contribution. I'd say it's generally less competitive. But that's something I would suggest you would probably want to, I would encourage everybody on this call to consult with CAL FIRE, take advantage of the 30-minute consultations they offer. And I would ask them that very specific question on your proposal, just to get their input. I think so to answer, Melissa, I think it may qualify, but you would want to confirm, because it could potentially be ineligible. Did anyone else have comment on that?
I support that answer. I think that sounds right to me too. It sounds like it potentially could qualify, but I would want to confirm before you base your entire application on that. And on the 9-to-1, yeah, on the 9-to-1 match, I was just going to say, just, you know, I mentioned this very quickly when I was talking, but, you know, other grants. I was talking to someone on one of the members of one of our peer network groups, and they had just gotten a grant. They applied to CAL FIRE last year. They didn't get the grant, but they got a grant for that same project. It's going to run for several years. And so that project, that money will be and serve as a match for the CAL FIRE project now, right? So that's a perfect example of how you would to reach that 9-to-1 level is quite, you know, it's a substantial amount, right? But if you have multiple grants from other agencies, state or federal, then those can go to, and that's how you could get to a 9-to-1 match for a bigger project.
And that's a really good thing to point out, that what Chris just said, a lot of some state agencies or federal agencies won't allow match of state or federal funds. Oftentimes you cannot match state funds with state funds, but in this case you can. They do allow state funds to be matched. And just building on this, Catherine had asked, can the same match be used as match for multiple grants? So an example, once a piece of equipment is identified as match for an awarded grant, can it be used for a subsequent grant application? I don't believe so. Generally, once the match has been used once and identified and you are tracking it for one grant, you can't use it for another. I think if you have some specific caveats to that or nuances, that would be worth checking with CAL FIRE. But generally speaking, it's just a one-time, this is how much we are including as match for these specific pieces that are for these specific activities in our project, and it has to be just used the one time.
Gary, is that all the questions in the chat? Did we get to them?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have a question that wasn't in the chat that you'd just like to come off mute and ask before we get to the second half of the presentation?
I'm sorry, Kathleen, actually, someone said there are very few, this is related to prevailing wage. There are very few Department of Industrial Relations rates for forestry
Right.
jobs. Is that going to change? I'm not sure that any of us on the call can necessarily speak to that. And I know that it's something that CAL FIRE cannot provide guidance on. But I believe that prevailing wage, their forestry projects are going to be considered public works projects. And so I'm not sure if that means that will change, but there is a move toward counting forestry projects as, or forestry jobs as public works. So I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to add. It's not an incredibly helpful answer, but. And Danielle, I'll mark this as a question that we can ask through our peer learning network folks. We are collecting topics that we can get presenters on and also just discuss in more detail during our peer learning network meetings, which happen monthly, and the information about those is on our website. This is a topic that I think is coming up for multiple folks as well.
And Carrie, did you see, I don't think we got to yet Jeff's question about what to emphasize with the greenhouse gas advantages of the projects. Anything
Yes.
on?
I think that, let's see, it may be most helpful to cover that after we talk
Okay.
about environmental documentation.
Yep. Okay. Okay, then let me go on to share screen again. And so there's a few more comments just coming into the chat. And Shane, thank you for putting in that comment about disadvantaged communities and information about that. Okay, so I'll go ahead and.
I just had a follow-up on that match question. If we're dedicating, say, 2 acres of our land towards the setup and longevity of the project, is that something you've seen added as a match contribution?
I'll jump in. I have not seen that used as match. So are you using that? Is it like for instance, a host site for, I don't know, a wood sorting yard or some sort of facility, or are you?
Yeah.
Okay. I have not seen that. I don't know if that would be eligible, but my sort of immediate inclination would be to count something related to the land as match. For instance, if you're having to do any site prep work or any permitting or surveys of the site. If, for instance, you're putting in, let's say, a water tank for fire protection, the tank itself, the cost of putting that in, I would tend to gravitate more towards that. Those activities would definitely be eligible as match. If I had to wager a guess, I would say the value of the land would not be eligible.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other?
Another question popped up from Greg. Yes, so it's really key for match. The main sort of thresholds for any match is that it has to be really specifically for the project you're proposing, and the money does have to be spent during the performance period. So even for equipment or supplies that you're counting, and Regine, actually, if you could jump in and just check me on this, like if you were going to count a piece of equipment as match, the value of that equipment, then you would need to purchase that equipment during the performance period. If you were going to donate, say, the cost of an operator running that equipment during the project, that would have to happen during the project performance period. So there are ways around, you know, the value of the equipment may be separate from like the cost of using the equipment. But if you're counting the value of that equipment, it has to be purchased during the project performance period, during the grant timeline.
That's absolutely right, Carrie. And other things too. I mean, for instance, fuel or maintenance on equipment could potentially be counted as match. Yeah, there's also the potential scenario where an applicant requests funding for equipment, and part of the cost of the equipment, say 60, at least 50%, if not more, would be match, and part of the cost of the equipment could be paid for by the grant. And taken together, those two sources of funds would support the entire cost of that piece of equipment. So that's another way you could potentially structure a funding request.
Okay, thank you. And there's another specific, well, two other questions about the potential last year for this business and workforce grant round. If you want to speak to that, Carrie, and that's unknown. And then a suggested cost per workforce development project. And Eric might need to come off and clarify that one, but go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, so as CAL FIRE said this yesterday, and I think that it is something to keep in mind, and it's something that I actually was going to touch on in a couple of the next slides, which we probably should get to. And I'm loving all of this back and forth about budgets as well, so we don't have to stop that, but I do want to cover some of the next things. But as far as the California Climate Investments funding source for this grant program, it does sunset in 2026. They have an endpoint for that actually impacts the date by which your project must be completed if you are awarded a grant. But CCI, this funding source, has not been the funding source for business and workforce development grant program throughout its lifetime. The funding for this program has come from other places. And the CCI funding is the reason why this is the first time you're being asked to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and priority populations. So I think that, you know, the funding for business and workforce development program is something that CAL FIRE is very motivated to continue and to keep going. They don't have a guarantee of future funding past this current solicitation that's due on March 8th. They are aiming to have future solicitations in the way that they have been doing, which in the past has been one in spring and then another in the fall. But it's unclear right now whether or not they will have the funding for a subsequent solicitation. So although this CCI funding source sunsets, it doesn't mean that business and workforce development is ending. However, they are not yet sure where the next round of funding will come from.
Thank you, Carrie. Could we go to your slides and then we can come back to remaining questions after that?
That sounds great.
Okay. So we'll do okay.
So again, as with some of the other slides, if you were on the CAL FIRE webinar yesterday, they really did a great job of covering environmental documentation. And if you didn't attend that, they will provide a recording for that webinar. And I think it's really useful to go ahead and watch that as well. But I think a few of the main pieces that are important to understand for environmental documentation is that the state funding from CAL FIRE triggers environmental review for all grants, regardless of land ownership. So if you're doing training activities on private land, if you're building a greenhouse on private land, having a grant from CAL FIRE still triggers some kind of environmental review. So if you think about any kind of effect that could happen on the ground, you're going to need to speak to environmental requirements. And CAL FIRE really highlighted that although they only provide one consultation with their wood product staff about your project, you can get directly in touch with Andrea Williams, who is their CEQA program lead. her email address is on the bottom of this slide, and that doesn't count as your one consultation with CAL FIRE. You can reach out to her at any time. And in fact, environmental documentation has been really a sticking point for CAL FIRE in terms of whether or not your grant is awarded. They want you to be as specific as possible to show them that you know what is required, that you've done the work to find out what's required, or that that CEQA or NEPA is already completed for your project, if indeed it is. If it's not yet complete, they need it to be complete within 1 year of grant agreement execution. And I think what's tricky about this is that it's really nuanced, especially for business and workforce development projects specifically. Kathleen, if you want to go to the next slide. This is just diving into this a little bit more deeply. We could have a really long workshop just on CEQA or environmental documentation by itself. And in fact, we may do that. We are in the process of developing a decision tree, a flow chart, a snippet of which you can see on the screen now, that really shows you what a CEQA process involves and what it looks like. It provides some definitions for key things like lead agency, what a project means under environmental documentation. Some of that is here on this slide. A project has the potential to cause a direct physical change or an indirect physical change in the environment. And the need for CEQA, the potential to use what's called CalVTP or NEPA depends on where your project is taking place. So we've had some questions in the past, like training programs where participants are going to be doing some thinning, learning to use equipment, and they're practicing on the ground. CAL FIRE does need to see environmental documentation for those activities. And similarly, the example I used before, building a greenhouse on private lands, this may trigger CEQA or at least some kind of permitting. If you're purchasing equipment that you'll use for a project on the ground, and you're asking CAL FIRE to help pay for that equipment, but not for the actual work on the ground, you still need to show that environmental documentation is complete for the land and the project work that piece of equipment would be used for. So there are a lot of ways that even though your project may not be directly having an impact on the ground by purchasing a piece of equipment, you still need to follow through and provide that backup documentation. And CAL FIRE wants to see it and approve it before any on the ground activities happen. So I think that there are a lot of different examples that could be anything large scale, from an initial study with an environmental impact report all the way to smaller projects where you'll just need a notice of exemption and ministerial approval, a permit issued from the county, something like that. So if you really don't know what you need, reach out to CAL FIRE CEQA staff for sure. If you generally know, but you don't have the specifics, then it's really helpful to reach out to whoever might be your lead agency for your project, talk to them about what's required, how long it would take, and then provide CAL FIRE with a letter of commitment from that lead agency if you can, because that's something that really shows CAL FIRE that you're prepared, your project is ready to go, and they highlighted that as something they really want to see. Let's see. I did include here this link to the CalVTP. Again, so much of this, we could spend hours talking about it, but I just wanted to provide a few sort of high level sources of information here. But I just want to pause and see if anyone has any environmental documentation or CEQA specific questions before I move on to the next slide.
Either raise your hand or put in the chat or come off mute if you have.
I had a question. Yeah, we got a grant through the Office of Planning and Research, the Governor's Office, and NCRP, and it's to develop a business plan to aggregate woody biomass. But we were not told that we were required to go through the CEQA process. Do you think if we got this CAL FIRE grant, then we probably would? Or what are your thoughts on that?
CAL FIRE, in from what I have heard from them, they are happy to rely on the findings from other entities, as long as that entity is you know, I think the OPR would be considered a reliable sort of entity for making a decision. I think in that case, I would definitely double check with Andrea Williams at CAL FIRE on that. But I think at minimum, what you'd want to provide is some kind of, any kind of documentation that you have from OPR on their findings, or other kinds of documentation you have related to, you know, any entity that you spoke with that helped you come to that conclusion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Jeff, do you want to go ahead and come off mute for your question?
Yeah, I just want to clarify what the lead agency is. I guess it varies from project to project. So is there always only one lead agency that determines whether or not you're going to be required to do CEQA, or could there be more than one lead agency? I think with what I'm doing, it's just the planning department here in Plumas County. Is there a possibility that there is some other lead agency that I would have to speak with?
No, you'll just have the one lead agency. And I think that most often that is a county or a city. And speaking with the county, if they are willing to act as lead agency, for CAL FIRE's purposes, one of the more important pieces of this would be just to get a letter of commitment from the county, for that you would include with your grant application as an attachment, stating that they're willing to be the lead agency, they're aware of your project, and basically just really making sure that that you are showing CAL FIRE that you have done all of the early steps that are required, so that they can feel more confident that you can hit the ground running. Basically, once the grant is awarded, the lead agency is in place, you're going to get things started with environmental documentation and permitting. You know how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost. So anything you can do to show them that you've done that homework, including a letter of commitment from just the one lead agency, is important.
Okay, so they make the decision to take the responsibility of being the lead agency. So I go to my planning department and they make the decision as to whether or not they want to be the lead agency, which has primary responsibility. Is that correct?
As far as I understand it, yes. I think Vance or Regine, if you have anything that you would add to this, I'd welcome that. But yes, as far as I understand, you request lead agency role and they will accept it. And if you run into issues where they won't accept the lead agency role, that's when I think folks can reach out to CAL FIRE as well. There are instances when CAL FIRE can act as a lead agency, but they generally will not.
And Vance just is putting in the comments, that's correct. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on this piece? And we'll let Carrie finish.
I just wanted to, just really quick, sorry, I was typing.
Thank you.
When there was a question about, I think Bodhi had a question about the OPR biomass aggregation project. Bodhi, I know OPR would likely not require you to complete CEQA related to that project because it's not defined as sort of it's basically a research sort of assessment. It's not an actual on the ground project. So sorry to digress on that, but feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss.
Thanks, Regine. And just for folks to know, Regine's been putting more specific responses to some of these in the comments. So make sure you're checking those out. Thank you for doing that, Regine. Okay, let me go ahead and continue for Carrie. Okay, so next slide, yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, there we go.
Great. So, so this is stepping back a bit into away from the sort of really detailed information.
Started
about
it from
CAL
the very
FIRE.
beginning and it works now, so,
And
Oh, good. So you can just watch it when you want,
yeah.
if you want.
if you can, yeah, thank you.
If you haven't muted, please go ahead and mute yourselves.
So this is really, I don't want to belabor this or spend too much time on this, but this is something that we've seen in providing technical assistance that is an important piece that I think is easy to overlook. So understanding the CAL FIRE requirements, you know, is something that's clearly very important. But there are a couple of different ways of thinking about readiness that I think are often overlooked. So with grant readiness, this is really meant for you to think about being ready to apply for any grant program at all. You know, if you know you want to get a grant, so often it's just diving into the details right away. But it's really important to have a really strong sense starting out why your project is needed, generally what needs to be done, how long it's going to take, and how much it's going to cost. And writing these things out in summary form can be a really helpful way if you're struggling around with how to get started on a grant application. Just start with the basics, step away from any of the required grant materials, and just write down some of these specific summary things about the project that you want to get funded. Also, getting really familiar with what it means to receive a grant. So in the CAL FIRE guidelines and in many other grant guidelines, if not all, you can find an example of a grant agreement that is the document you'll be required to sign if you are awarded a grant. Looking through this is really important and understanding the reporting requirements so that you can then make sure that you are budgeting your project appropriately to cover the costs that it will require to actually receive the grant funding. Understanding that grants are reimbursements. They are not, there are some cases where you can request advance funding and also potentially get loans that can help you cover costs until you're reimbursed by grants. But to understand how grant funding functions is really important. And also then knowing the specific priorities and requirements of the grant program you're going for is again really important. I think a lot of times people spend a lot of time trying to make sure that their bio sounds really great when actually you really need to have a lot of your detailed work done. You need to know why your project is important and be able to communicate that effectively. And then just dropping down a little bit more into project specific readiness. You know where the project is going to take place. You have, if it's not land that you own, you have permission from the landowner. You have a letter of participation or a letter of support from that landowner. You know what's required to actually do the work on that land, and you can speak to it in your grant application. Similarly, partners, you know what any of your partners are going to do, and they're ready to provide letters of support or participation. And one thing that I've had questions on that I think is also important to think about for this piece, partners and subcontractors are different. And so when you're thinking through how you're going to present your project to a funder or to CAL FIRE, knowing the difference between those things is also really important. A partner is an external entity that will work with you on a project, a subcontract, and they could also get a portion of your grant budget. A subcontractor is someone that you will hire to do some of the work that you're proposing. For subcontractors, you don't need to get a letter of participation. For a partner, you do. This last piece under project readiness, your project aligns with grant requirements regarding readiness and required completion date. Kathleen, if you'll go to the next slide. So for the business and workforce development program specifically, what readiness really means for them is for you to know that they will most likely announce grant awards in May. They're really prioritizing and looking for projects that can be ready to kick off once a grant agreement is in place. They need projects that are awarded under this funding program to be completed by March 31st, 2026. That's a deadline that is the date by which the funds need to be expended. So you won't be able to invoice or get any funding for projects after that date. And then just reiterating this environmental permitting or documentation completed within 1 year of grant agreement execution. So when you're thinking about readiness to apply, thinking about these big picture dates is really important. This again is relatively sort of basic, but also can really help you think through the steps that you need to take or should take for proposal preparation. And this is just really like a flow of operations that you could follow to complete a grant application. Really get familiar with the grant guidelines. Make sure that you know what eligible costs include, and it's listed in the guidelines. You know that your project priorities align with CAL FIRE's priorities so that you can answer those questions within the grant application. Creating an eCivis account and exploring the site is also something that I would recommend you do early. eCivis there's some challenges that can pop up and some glitches that can pop up. So you can get in, you can create a test application. You can click around. If you have questions about eCivis, it's always best to ask them early rather than at the last minute, because there's some things that are not clear until you're starting to enter the information. Sometimes there are in their drop-down menus that show up, there are ways that the budget will calculate things the first time, but not if you change the numbers. They're just some things to keep in mind that if you can get in and get familiar early, that's helpful. I always like to create a checklist of the required proposal elements, all of them. Look at what's going to be most time consuming or what's going to be most time sensitive. May not take you very long to draft a template for a letter of support or participation, but it may take someone that you're requesting some time to provide that letter back. Things like this, that it's really important just to have a checklist so you know when you're going to get these things done for yourself internally. We do have a template for this. If you want to use it, you're welcome to. And if you have questions about that, definitely feel free to reach out. Reiterating setting up a consultation with CAL FIRE. They are great at responding to questions. It does take some time, so do it early. Forest Business Alliance also can provide technical assistance beyond just this webinar, and I'll go over that in a moment. And the last piece is just really a best practice for any grant at all. Make sure that you're working towards submitting at least 3 to 5 days before the deadline. It's really hard to do that. But if you plan to submit 5 days in advance, maybe you'll submit 2 days in advance. And it really is amazing after 15 years of submitting grants, dozens and dozens of grants a year, how often on that deadline day, some sort of unforeseeable technical glitch comes up. The power goes out, the website's not working, your internet is down. Don't wait till the last minute. Great. So building on this idea of the technical assistance, this is just a snapshot of our Forest Business Alliance website. Technical assistance for Forest Business Alliance. It's things like this that we're doing right now, this workshop. We also have workshops on creating a business plan. That's available. The recording is available on our website. If you watch that recording and then you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to us and we can talk to you more about that topic. In addition, for the Peer Learning Network, we meet monthly. We have folks who present at each meeting about specific topics, and then we have time for folks to talk to each other about challenges they're facing in funding, in project development, in other topics. And we encourage folks, the more people participate, I think the more useful the sessions can be for everyone. And for technical assistance for this grant program, for which the deadline is coming up on March 8th, if you have specific questions that you want to talk over with us to brainstorm, you'd like us to review any of your documents, we are here to provide that. We cannot write the grant for you, but we can look at what you've written and provide some suggestions. We can do a deeper dive into questions regarding your specific project. A lot of folks on our team, Regine and Chris and others, have a lot of experience with grants and also specifically with forest sector grants, Vance also, and you know, we're here for that. And I think lastly on that technical assistance topic, the next slide, Kathleen. This is just a snapshot again of our templates on our website. There are some templates that CAL FIRE requires that you use that they have developed. They have a grants timeline and CEQA Excel spreadsheet you're required to use, but they don't have a scope of work template. So we went ahead and created templates for some of the narrative pieces to help you think through what your responses could be to different elements that are required for you to respond to. And similarly with eCivis. And then also some of the project goals and budgets as well. This is password protected. You can reach out to any of us at any time. I did put the password in the chat and can do so again. We just like to be able to keep track of folks accessing this. So feel free to reach out at any time about that. And this is again our website and our Gmail address for getting in touch.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so that we can navigate any other additional questions. And I'm happy to put that in the chat if anyone didn't get a chance for that. So does anyone have any questions you'd like to come off mute and ask of either part of this presentation or something that's come up since then?
Yes, I'd like to ask about the additional greenhouse gas issue. See, I heard you say that in general, what they're looking for is a kind of a qualitative assessment of what your project is and how it would affect greenhouse gas issues. But I think I heard you say that if your project has a direct quantitative effect, that it would be good to present some kind of quantitative information. So for instance, I'm working on a biomass processing facility that would take forest wood chips and make them into a substitute for peat moss. So we would be shipping out solid material to industry rather than burning it, which has, because it's sequestering carbon, you know, that's an obvious advantage. But another thing is that because it offsets the use of peat moss is a heavy greenhouse gas material, but that's not harvested in California, right? It's harvested in Canada. That's where the greenhouse gas issue arises. So I'm wondering if I should try to quantify the effects of peat moss, greenhouse gas issues, and say that the use of the biomass that I'm proposing offsets that, and to what extent I should try to quantify issues like that.
Jeff, I would say, and please definitely jump in, Chris and others. But I would say that if I were you, I would include that as a specific and concise description as a narrative in your project. I wouldn't try to use the calculator to provide any actual numbers. If you do have numbers and a source for those numbers, it doesn't hurt to include some of that information. What CAL FIRE said is they're going to try and make this as easy on folks as possible. So if they see that your project could be quantified in that way, they will follow up with you if your grant is awarded to ask for things like a shapefile that they can use to do the modeling for you and to complete the calculator themselves, because there's a specific way that they're quantifying this under this funding program. So I would say that it's a great idea to describe that. And you know, there are no boundaries in some ways for greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not as though you cross the border and suddenly it doesn't matter anymore. So I would include that, but I don't think that you would need to do that quantification using the calculator tool yourself. Chris, would you add anything to that?
Well, I was going to say the same thing, essentially. It's just going to clarify in my description too. Went through it pretty quickly. Jeff, I was suggesting that it may be useful as you're preparing your narrative to look at some of those documents that I mentioned, like, or in the calculator itself, but not to try to use it to generate a calculation. Just looking at the calculator and the CARB quantification methodologies, it might give you some ideas about how you want to frame it in your narrative. But I don't, again, like Carrie said, I don't suggest you try to go ahead and do those calculations, because CAL FIRE has said explicitly, and they say that in the solicitation guidelines, that they're going to do that for successful applicants. But it might be useful to go ahead and look at those things if you're inclined. Again, they're quite lengthy, but if you're, you know, it might give you some ideas on how to frame your justifications.
Yes. So I think the direction I'm going is to read all that carefully so I can frame it, and also maybe to provide basic numbers that are accepted for how much carbon there is in biomass, how wood chips, how much carbon there is in peat moss, et cetera, without trying to do any kind of calculations, but just provide basic numbers that they can then use for their calculation.
Yes. And I think that as far as, you know, what they said during the webinar yesterday, and I think it was really helpful to understand, is that really for this greenhouse gas piece, they're expecting for the greenhouse gas benefits to be relatively indirect for this grant program, because so much of this funding isn't directly funding on the ground work. It's more indirectly funding the on the ground work. And so in the same way, a lot of the greenhouse gas benefits will be more indirect. So in the cases where it's very clear to them that there's a direct greenhouse gas implication, then they'll work with you to ask for the information that they need to use the calculator themselves. Where it's a little bit different, and I want folks to understand too, is this idea of priority populations and co-benefits. That's where they're really looking to you to talk about the priority populations in your project area, any work that you've done to identify their needs and how your project addresses those needs. I think that there are some ways in which this can be done using a lot of the information that's already here on these websites. But definitely rely on the links that they provide, particularly in Appendix F and in eCivis in your project information form section. There are some links that they direct you to respond to the questions that they have there. There's a specific GIS website that shows the disadvantaged communities and can help you identify the specific needs and these priority populations. So I'll put this in the chat again. This is the map that they want folks to use for identifying priority populations, which is disadvantaged and low-income communities. There are other maps that show disadvantaged communities and low-income communities, but this is the specific map they're asking folks to access in the guidelines. So I think this is really a good place to start.
And I'll just add briefly to the discussion about both GHG benefits and co-benefits and priority populations. Our team is working to put together a workshop specific to co-benefits between now and the grant deadline. So we'll advertise that once the details are set. But just as each of you are thinking about the benefits of your project or the co-benefits, I think one way to approach it is to consider what are some of the unique resources to your particular geography. If you're in a headwaters area, if there are sort of wildland urban interface areas that your project will help to facilitate, reduce hazardous fuels. If it's in an area of sort of known for recreation, there's, thinking in those sorts of terms and co-benefits, while you're not necessarily quantifying those benefits, it may help you to sort of get thinking about how to describe those in sort of brief narrative format.
And also, if you're in a high fire severity zone, that's another element that you could look at, because public safety, increasing public safety is also something to consider when you're thinking through priority population benefits.
Excellent. Thank you both. Any other questions that people want to unmute for and ask directly? Go ahead, buddy.
I was curious about the peer learning network and just how that's set up and could potentially help us in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Carrie, do you want to speak to that one, or do you want me to?
If you want to go ahead, Kathleen, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. So the peer learning network, we have monthly calls on the, second Tuesday, right? Third Tuesday of the month at noon. They usually go an hour and a half to 2 hours. And we bring in speakers that we've got a survey that we sent in the beginning when we started, kind of gauging specific topic of interest that folks might be interested in hearing about, specifically related to forest related businesses. And it's been a combination of then specific presenters around some of those topics, as well as folks from the network themselves that are kind of sharing on different projects that they're working on, and addressing topics that have also been illuminated from the group. And the next one will be on finance and business with Thomas Secco. That is in 2 weeks' time. And we always allow time for breakout rooms. So if there are specific topics that folks want to talk about, for example, sawmills or small sawmills, or grant proposals, or project financing, we have a specific part of these meetings dedicated towards the breakout room, so that you can go in and specifically talk about with other folks who are dealing with the same issues, or ask questions of folks from the Forest Business Alliance or the presenters on specific topics. So we try to make it both general information at a higher level, but then also give folks a time to learn from each other and share project updates, or if they've recently applied and gotten funding, what worked, what didn't, that sort of thing. And we record them, and then we share them on the Forest Business Alliance. So if you've missed some in the past, those recordings are available, and you can go back and listen to those as well. And then at the end of each one too, we do ask and send out a survey to kind of see what worked and what folks liked, and also where you might like to hear other specific topics. So that has been some of the direction that has led to the topics that we've addressed in subsequent months. What am I missing, Carrie?
I would just add, and it's something actually that I haven't highlighted yet and should have earlier. We are also getting started a lot of specific outreach and peer learning network development for tribal entities. So not just federally recognized tribes, but tribally led nonprofits or individuals or projects with a tribal focus. And so that's something that is not yet really called out on any of our materials, but we have a tribal liaison, Sherilyn Ashmead. She's not on the call today, but she is doing that work. And so if anyone on this call or anyone who knows of someone who's not on this call is either involved in tribal work or projects, that's something that we're getting started and really diving into. And we will be weaving that into a lot of our materials more explicitly.
Yeah, thank you
And
for that.
Just
Go ahead.
briefly, I'll add that for folks just to kind of keep an eye out, we do plan to do an in-person sort of peer learning network meeting this spring. So we'll solicit that information once it becomes available, or rather advertise that information once it becomes available. But that would be a great opportunity just to get together face to face and sort of establish some of the relationships and build ones that are already existing to really try to catalyze your own projects and efforts.
Yep. Thanks, Regine. I was just thinking of that too, and we'll see if we can announce that in just a moment. Catherine, go ahead. Did you have a question?
I do, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but I'm on your website, and is there a way to get on like your email notification list? I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Vance?
Yeah, Vance.
No, not really.
Okay.
Not yet, anyway. If you're in this meeting, you're happy to, you're on our email list, and we'll add you to that, but
Yeah.
we still need to do a better job of automating that.
And the contact information for the Forest Business Alliance is on there, so you can always send an email to confirm and make sure that you get on that, and we'll add you that
Sure.
way.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Catherine. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, the documents that you referred to for getting more insight on the greenhouse gas issue, are those the documents that are listed in the guidelines, or are they different documents? And if so, how do I refer to them?
Yeah, I'll put those in the chat here. I don't think they might be mentioned somewhere in the guidelines, but I had to go search them out myself. There was no link to them, I don't believe.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, problem.
Jeff, in some cases, Appendix F in the guidelines provides a starting place for a lot of these things, but it really does require some clicking through. But Appendix F is a great place to start too.
And
Thanks.
just a note, the in-person meeting that'll likely be in April, when it's announced, it'll be posted on the Forest Business Alliance website too, so you can check back there shortly, and we'll have the details up about that. Any other questions that anyone would like to ask about anything that's been presented or anything that hasn't that you're hoping to hear about? Going once. Okay. All right. Well, we want to, go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, sorry for the short call there. I was interested in working with local farmers in economically depressed areas to convert them over into growing native trees for reforestation efforts. And my recollection from past iterations of this workforce development opportunity was that nursery programs did not have that matching funds requirement, but I'm not seeing that call out in this particular opportunity. So do you have any information on that, or is that something that I should go direct to CAL FIRE and ask?
That's a really great question, Heidi. I think that it Chris, unless this is something that you have really taken a deep dive into, I think that this is something that would be best to double check with CAL FIRE, because some of the changes that were made, I think a few things have been lost that were clear before, and it's really helpful just to go back and make sure with them. I don't see anything specific to that. The only thing that's called out that is still here is if you are asking for funding to develop a business plan, you don't need to meet the minimum award amount. You can ask CAL FIRE to help you fund the business plan development itself. And that has a different requirement for funding limitations. But I'm not sure about the match piece for what you have asked about specifically.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we need to double check. I agree. It's not clear to me from the guidelines either. So I think we need to double check with them.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Going once. All right. Thank you all for coming here. This recording will be up on the website shortly. And so if you want to refer to it or let people know it's there. And again, you can reach out to the Forest Business Alliance directly for support in the upcoming proposal development, and for all other webinars around these topics. We'll also be posting them on the page itself so that you can go and register there on the Forest Business Alliance page. So with that, thank you all for coming. Best of luck on your upcoming proposals, and we'll look forward to seeing you at future meetings. And thank you to Carrie and Chris for all the presentation, and to Regine for all the reporting questions in the chat and your additional support. So this is definitely a team effort. Thank you all.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.